Thank you, Mark. He forgot to tell you I'm also a notary public, so if you need anything stamped, well. I tell you, I was a bit surprised when Mark invited me to speak to this august body because, my education in cultural diplomacy is all at the International House of Pancakes. In all those little towns all across America for so many years, I would sit and listen to people talking about, their concerns. And basically, they were talking about the widening gap between the haves and the have-nots and, the gridlock in government for people we elect that would prefer, gridlock to compromise. And so I got a really kind of an interesting firsthand look of how we are perceived in the world. What we know of America comes from journalists who travel in herds. And they pounce on problems to repeat over and over again. And maybe they come back 6 weeks later to say, oh, that problem hasn't been fixed yet. Still terrible. When they offer up solutions, they offer up celebrities. The people who spend their days speaking to camera. And maybe they're not the ones that have all the wisdom. I've spent most of my time with seemingly ordinary Americans who solve problems with common sense solutions. I'll only give you one statistic, and this is a doozy. When most of us talk about diversity in our countries, we talk about a handful of different nationalities maybe, or groups. In this country, 198 different nationalities learn how to get along. Not too far from here, over in Brooklyn, if you take the B68 bus down Coney Island Boulevard, you will pass a Dunkin' Donuts that is owned by a Muslim and is operated by a kosher Jewish rabbi. That's not just Brooklyn. It's all over the world, and all over the United States especially. You can win a couple of bar bets if you ask what was the most diverse state in the United States. New York? California maybe? It's Oklahoma. Oklahoma was settled by people who came with nothing and people who were pushed in there because other people wanted what they had. Oklahoma was not a state until 1907. It had 28 towns that were founded by ex-slaves. There are 37 different Indian nations in that one state. And Hollywood would have us see that all of the Native Americans look alike. But I'll tell you, having lived for 10 years in Oklahoma, met my wife there, the Indians in Oklahoma are as different as an Italian is to a Swede. And yet somehow they all get along. For many years it was a territory primarily of the red and the black, a kind of a checkerboard. Indians and ex-slaves. Until someone announced all over the world, guess what? There's going to be some free land runs. Where else? Oklahoma Territory. So thousands of those 198 different countries, people who had nothing, couldn't afford to buy something someplace else, they showed up on land runs and got ranches and homes in one day. Now they all talk like this today, and they all vote Republican, but when you consider all the different people that are in one little state, perhaps the size of Croatia, and they somehow figured out how to move forward. Now, I'm not talking about elected officials, because we all know about elected officials, but I'm talking about ordinary people who decided to band together. So, what did I learn in 4 million miles crisscrossing this country? One of the things I thought was that these people who are quiet and unassuming and that we never ask and are too busy to tweet about what they're doing and never run for president or write books, they figured out a certain code to help us figure how to move forward in life peacefully. Now, we all know the well-documented problems, but I'm talking about all the others, and there are thousands of them. They forged what may be a formula for us moving forward for peace on earth, or as close as we can get to it. Out there in Brooklyn, at that Dunkin' Donuts, most of the people in the neighborhood are from Russia and the Ukraine, or from Pakistan and India. Now back home, some of their friends and neighbors are at each other's throats. And these people all have taxi cab companies that they work together in, and grocery stores, and their kids all go to schools. So how did they get that way? What did they learn to do? Well, I think it all starts with the shortest distance between two people is a good story. Once I understand your story, I'm not so ignorant about who you are or where you came from, but I start to see not our differences, but how we all are alike. When I was a young reporter in Oklahoma, I was stopping in one of those early morning cafes, and I heard this guy named Sidney Klein Church. And he was about 80 years old, and he had a voice like a bugle, and it rattled and was real loud, and he was telling stories that obviously everybody else in the diner had heard before, so they weren't listening. But I stood up right next to him, because he was talking about a guy who showed up in Oklahoma with 600 ex-slaves. It was November, and it was too late to plant anything, and they were all starving to death. So what did he do? He goes down to the Rock Island Railroad station. Even though it hadn't been settled yet, there were trains going between Dallas and Wichita, about 4 trains a day. And he started singing to the passing trains. Well, first of all, they laughed at him. But then after a while, they started throwing dimes and quarters. And this guy used that money to feed not just the ex-slaves, but the immigrants and the Native Americans who were all waiting for one of those free land runs in April. He fed them out throughout the entire winter. Well, once the people on the trains heard about that, they started kicking chickens out of the train. A couple of traveling salesmen, gave a couple of cows. And Paul Sykes ended up feeding people for years and years and years. Now, Sidney Klein Church at this point was about the same age that Paul Sykes was when he was telling this tale. And he said, I was an illegal immigrant. I said, really? Yeah. He said, I jumped ship in Galveston, and I hitchhiked to Oklahoma, and I was a janitor at the railroad station, and I used to watch this guy singing. He sang for 27 years. 27 years. And every time he got enough money or food, he fed the entire town. He says, so since America was good to me, I joined the Army in World War I. And he says, I was overseas in France. I was wounded. I was waiting on a train station platform to take a train back to Le Havre and then hospital ship home. A French officer came up to me and he said, where are you from? And he says, I'm from Oklahoma. He said, really? He says, what part? He says, a little town called Kingfisher, Oklahoma. And he says, the French officer kind of looked amazed and he said, Kingfisher? The black man? Does he still sing and dance there? Well, Sidney Klein Church goes, yeah. And he got to talking on the train, and he said, of all the sights and sounds in America, this French officer, who was a French salesman touring the United States prior to the war, one thing he remembered was Paul Sykes, who sang and danced for 27 years and fed that town and all the people who came there, ex-slaves, immigrants, Native Americans, who were waiting for a better time. So that's the first lesson that I learned. Ordinary Americans embrace differences. Now, you wouldn't think that's so, but it's absolutely true. I've watched them work because they realize that all of us who come from all over the world approach the same problem with a different set of ideas. And it helps them solve the problem that much more quickly. One of the best brain surgeons in the world, down at Johns Hopkins, some of you might have been there in the last couple of days, Alfredo Quiones, who himself was an illegal immigrant when he came to the United States. All of the people he has working with him to try to solve brain cancer are people from around the world, and that's by design. Students from around the world, because he says each one of us, if we were all from Cincinnati, would think in the same way and we'd kind of walk into walls. But he says everybody else kind of pushes each other off kilter by coming at it from a different way, and so we solve that problem. So they embrace differences. And each day they face still every task with a pioneer spirit. The pioneer spirit that pulled all of our ancestors to these shores. It's a willingness to work together for opportunities and for hope. It is part of their geography of hope. That's the second lesson. People who are ordinary Americans um, learn how to connect and work as teams. Now, why is that so? Well, who wants to go on the Oregon Trail by themselves, right? And they don't care if the person sitting next to them in the wagon came from someplace else because they've got to get down the road. That's still around today. I was intrigued by a little town I heard about that's far from the rest of us. It's way up in a high mountain valley, surrounded by 29 ghost towns. And I wondered why this town still existed if everything else had disappeared out there. So I went out to take a look. 900 people. They have their own opera company, and they produce 2 fresh operas a year. They figured out a way to raise money to keep their hospital going. How'd they do it? They started selling clothes and items to each other and then donating the price to the hospital. They have a superintendent of schools who came down with cancer, and he was off playing golf before he was going to go to the hospital, and he was worried about being able to pay for this treatment that he had coming up. And he told me, I came back one day and there was a big tent over Main Street, and everybody in town, all 900 people were in there, and they gave me a check for $40,000 for my treatment. And I survived. And then 9 years later, his 9-year-old daughter came down with a different kind of cancer, and she needed $100,000 for the treatment. So the town held auctions, and they auctioned off not just out of the goodness of their hearts, but they auctioned off things that other people might need. Maybe a cattle chute, and maybe you would buy that for $10,000, but because it was for the little girl, you gave 20. This was a town of blue-collar, ordinary working people. There were no wealthy people there. They thought they were going to be wealthy when they first went there. They beat everybody else in the West to Montana's first silver mines. But when the silver mines closed, they clung to their town, and they clung to each other, even when jobs came and went and times boomed and busted. And they're still there, while 29 other towns around them are gone. So I asked the ranch manager, I said, is it just the core of the American story? Is it you risk everything because you want to do good? And he says, no. He says, we figure we love this town. We love where we live. And if we didn't help each other out of nightmares, the town would disappear. So we're really saving ourselves. So they have this innate vision of how to survive and how to save each other, from teamwork and diversity. That really is at the core of the American story, because all of our ancestors risked everything to get here. They did. There was no guarantees when they got on the boat. So that same pioneer spirit is part of the DNA. If you can see what's worthwhile risking everything, and then get a team together to do it, and start looking for what unites us, what cultural bridges unite us, then that'll work. Part of what I also saw in that town was you could build a cultural bridge on a word alone. The little quiet Americans who make this country work, their word is as good as their bond. They get things done. It doesn't have to be in a big way, but if they say, I'm going to go help, build this fence, they show up and they build the fence. And they also help their neighbors turn nightmares into dreams. I'll give you a case in point. 2 people out in Fort Collins, Colorado. The husband is a mechanic, the wife is a nurse, and they always wanted a daughter. But they figured that wasn't going to work because they'd already had 5 boys. So they adopted a little girl who was escaping the Vietnam War. Except she showed up, and about 2 weeks later, her sister showed up, and then a brother, and then another sister, 5 more kids. So the family of 5 boys with a blue-collar mom and dad had 10 kids. They put all their dreams on hold for this family. All of these kids who came in rickety little boats, their parents obviously tried to escape after the communists took over as a family, but that never worked out. So 2 by 2, they put them in boats and just sent them off to sea. Tun Ya Tran, who was 11 the first time I met her, was telling me about the last meal that she had with her mom and dad. And she said, we prayed together, we ate together, and Mom looked at me and said, do the best you can when you get to America. She was convinced that this boat somehow was going to float to America. I don't know. Well, Marty Dwyer, the American mom, looked up at me and said, I don't think I could love my kids enough to have them risk their lives by themselves. And Tunya looked at her and he said, well, my mom decided that it was more important to have hope. Well, did they do a good job? Tunya Tran graduated #2 from the medical school at Johns Hopkins University, and she's now a brilliant research physician out in California. All of her brothers and sisters graduated from college too. And for a dozen years, starting when they were little kids, they did odd jobs to raise enough money so eventually, when their mom and dad would be able to get out of Vietnam and join them, they'd have enough cash to come. Last time I saw Tunya, she now had a daughter who was the same age she was when she was put in that boat. And her mom and dad from Vietnam had a house across the street from the American mom and dad who had raised their kids for 12 years and shared the same love. They had not much in common with people from Vietnam escaping war, other than the fact that they started to see what they had in common. They loved family. Parents loved their family too in a different way. And so they started to see how they were alike as opposed to how they were different. And isn't that why you're all here today? To try to figure out, every country's got a war college. How about a peace college? Well, you guys are the first class of the peace college. See what I mean? And that's it. There was a great comedian named Flip Wilson who used to say, we Americans might have come over in different ships, but we're in the same boat now. And we have to figure out how to navigate this thing together in order to survive. And so time and again I've seen towns with humor and patience and loving care that have helped neighbors so different from themselves get through. You got to wonder how a town of 900 people out in the middle of Montana could survive. Well, it's the same as a man who came here from Turkey and opened up a little shop in the suburbs of Boston. And he told all of his friends, it's a Great Depression back in the 1930s, and I'm going to find out all the people who are out of work who could kind of help me, and I'm going to offer them a simple solution out of poverty. And every person he hired to work in his factory, he asked one simple question. If I take care of your family, will you take care of mine? Well, sure, they're all out of work. I want to come work. That was 80 some odd years ago. They have never had a layoff in that factory, ever. I talked to a guy who said, I worked there 26 years. I've never had a layoff at all. Well, how does that work? Once again, here's one of the solutions that ordinary Americans came up with. George Plaskus, who I met, a Greek immigrant, he has been retrained on his job 8 times since he came to work there. Because the deal was, when your job is automated, and it will be, we'll find something else in this company that you can do that's worth your salary. And we will retrain you to do that. He had been retrained 8 times, factory worker, lived a solidly middle-class life, had 2 daughters, and one of them is a doctor. Well, many of America's most successful businesses were built by those kinds of immigrants and people in front offices who look beyond quarterly profits. For 15 years, Zildjian's granddaughter offered an incentive pay, and this is kind of interesting, not for working faster or producing more, but for doing it right the first time. Quality is not just a slogan in this company. And they've only had one time in 15 years that they didn't award some money. Because everybody on the line has to approve the work before it moves on to the next person. Now, once your name is on that, and of course you still have to do it fast, you know, you got to be in business. But what happens is, they did such a great product that they survived. Now, this company has survived for many, many years. In fact, it started in 1320 in Istanbul, Turkey. Started making cymbals, and it survived the move to Massachusetts, and it survived all the hard times. All the people who were there prospered during that time. And how did they do it? Well, because if you take care of my family, I'll take care of yours. Well, this is a question I posed to them, to the granddaughter. I said, do you get an idea that maybe you ought to sell this company because it's really worth a lot of money? And she says, oh yeah, every week. She says, I'd love to sell it, make big bucks. But then I think, you know, I've got Amelia, my granddaughter, who's coming along, and she's 6. And if she becomes the new CEO, it will be the 16th generation. Now, a lot of people go to Harvard Business School and study how to do a business, right? Why not study the Zildjians? And not just the people in the front office, not the people wearing the suits, but the people who have made this commitment to work in the company so that they can all do a better job, have a better life, and trust each other. I mean, how many people trust their companies these days? You know, it used to be that if you worked hard and did well, you would be with the company for a long time and retire and all that. And now we all know what the story is, but not with the Zildjians. And again, it isn't just out of the goodness of their heart. They came up with a formula. And the formula is, we've got to stay current like every other company, but we're not going to throw away people who know how to do things and are already loyal to the company anyway. We're going to retrain you. Now, you're going to have to be willing to retrain. Maybe you first started just pushing a cymbal cart from one side of to the other, but obviously that's going to be done by machines. But by the time you get through with 20 or 30 years, you're going to learn a lot of stuff about how to do a lot of things. But meanwhile, our companies will prosper. With the Zildjian company today, 125 people in the suburbs of Boston have half the cymbal business in the world. Hell, the Beatles played with Zildjian cymbals. And they did it with making sure that they innovated, and they did it with every time you got a cymbal, it was really good. 98% of their product comes out perfect. How many companies, asked General Motors, how many people can say that about their products? But if you can do that, you found a common sense solution to a problem we all face. Now, we never asked these people. Classic case in point. You know, the Romans had indoor plumbing, you know, a few hundred years before Jesus. And then some guys got drunk in Asia Minor on a Friday night, came down, sacked Rome, and everybody forgot how to put toilets back in houses for 1,000 years. And it wasn't until, what, the 1800s we finally put bathrooms back in homes again? Why? Because we didn't ask the people who knew how to make bathrooms. They looked so ordinary, and they seemed too much like us that probably we don't need to talk to them. But what is it? Of course, they ended up with the answer of how to do something. Ordinary Americans could send a UN committee to lunch because they come up with those kinds of quiet and unassuming answers all the time. And when I say ordinary Americans, I'm not sitting there waving the flag. I'm saying ordinary 198 different nationalities came up with those solutions. They may all talk like this now, but they didn't when they first got off the boat. And they prospered. By and large, they prospered. Okay, what I'm talking about with innovative ideas. There's a fellow named Rex Zeek, Z-I-A-K, Rex Zeek, who decided that the historians were all wrong, and that these two great explorers that went from one side of the United States to the other, Lewis and Clark, when they were thinking about building or opening up a new national park, that all the historians and all the geographers had it wrong on where they actually saw the Pacific Ocean. Rex Zeek spent 10 years researching it and found out the answer. So now they're making the national park primarily on, in different places because Rex Zeek had found all the places that these guys had stopped, and he was not invited to the ceremonies. So all of his friends emailed me, and I said, got to do a story on this. So I went out and talked to him, and he says, oh, that's by design. He says, how do you think I got this national park done? He says, you have to attract power and money. He says, I have no power, and I have no money. So he said, if I stood up next to the people who love to be on the Today Show and love to have their pictures in newspapers, power and money, they'd all step back because it would put a lie to the fact that they really didn't do it, but this guy standing next to him did it, so you don't get it done. He said, what I decided, talking to some of my friends and neighbors, was the way to handle this was the same way I taught my child how to ride a bike. When the little girl finally wobbles off across the parking lot, you know, with the 2 training wheels on, power and money, she says, I don't run along and wave at all the neighbors and say, look what I did. Dad did a heck of a job. Because the child would never ride the bike again. Be so embarrassed, wouldn't do it, right? So it's the same way with power and money. Once you've attracted power and money, step back into the shadows and applaud because you got it done. Now, is that not common sense and native? You know, it has nothing to do with the national park. You could go to a parent-teachers association and get something done that way. Or as Rex Zeke says, there's no limit to what we can do if we don't care who gets the credit. Now, in a world where everybody wants credit, that just kind of catches up, you know, by surprise. So he didn't get to go, and he thought it was no big deal. As he points out, loss creeps into all of our lives. And I learned that in my own backyard. When I graduated from the University of Kansas, my dad took me out, a cup of coffee, and he said, you know, I never went to college. And I said, I knew that. He says, actually, I had to drop out of school in the 5th grade. Didn't know that. He said, yeah, he says, my father went in the Army and he never came home, and my mother had 3 kids. And back in those days, you know, a mom who's not married, living in a big city, needed help, so she sent me out to work for a farmer as an indentured servant, 10-year-old boy. I got room and board, and they sent the money back to my mother to help raise my sister and younger brother. He said, about a year later, my aunt came out with her brother, who was a cop, and buggy whipped the farmer. Because apparently they'd been sending me $1 once in a while, and he'd been steaming it open and taking it. So they took me back to live with them, and I got a job as a janitor in an auto body plant making wooden auto bodies. And he says, my job as a then 11-year-old boy was to climb underneath the assembly line and get all the wood shavings. It was the loneliest year of my life because everybody, all the adults on that assembly line were first-generation immigrants, and none of them spoke English. He says, about 6 months in, one man had learned enough English that he said to me, you know, Bill, you ought to go to night school. I said, really? Yeah. He said, yeah. He says, I did go to night school. I took that immigrant's advice. I went 23 years to night school. And then, when you were born, I went out and I got, a cutting stone and started my own optical company. I got an honorary master's degree in ophthalmics. What happened was, as soon as I opened up my business with a partner, he ran off with all the money. And the next month, Bob, you got polio. This was all new to me. I was 21 years old. I'd never heard this story. I said, what'd you do? And he said, well, I started again. I started a business that bankrolled our family and paid for the first Dotson to graduate from college. You. The American story. They don't dwell on loss. Loss creeps into all of our lives. Usually when you hear people, they always talk about, well, what happened to my girlfriend 5 months ago? What happened when I lost my job? Or the fire burned me down? But these people, I'm talking about the ones that we need to see as beacons. They say, okay, that happened. Now what? Where do I go from here? So the lesson that ordinary Americans taught me was, don't dwell on loss. That's why I started all those years ago looking behind the media mirror that reflects popular culture and the powerful. to see people standing in the shadows like my dad. You can learn a lot from my dad. So what roadmap do these ordinary Americans follow that makes them successful? This is going to seem kind of strange, but they simply follow every day a simple lesson. What's going to make me smile today? You know, and our Constitution says pursuit of happiness. I call it just find something every day that'll make you smile. Now, you're not always going to make that, but you're going to try that. So, okay, your kid's got polio. What can I do today to make my smile? What can I do to make him smile? They don't give up. They don't dwell on loss. They find a way forward, and they don't do it by themselves. My 3-year-old grandson was thrilled when he found out that I was going to be speaking to you today. Because he said, oh, there are people from all over. I said, yeah. He said, well, you've got to ask them one thing. I said, what's that? He says, well, I got a little girl in my preschool class, and she came from Istanbul. He was really thrilled that he could pronounce that, Istanbul. And he says, you know what I asked her yesterday? And I said, no. He said, you're from Turkey, right? And the little girl said, yeah. He says, what's Turkey like? Is it a lot like chicken? So, you know, we built our first cultural bridge. Well, humor, of course, helps build bridges, but also genuine concern for your neighbors helps build that bridge. You know, our ancestors back in their birth countries seldom got to see neighbors that were different than themselves. They didn't. They talked about those people, whoever it might be in the next block over, but they didn't see a lot of them. They just saw themselves. And they end up in this country where suddenly they're sharing space with 198 different nationalities. Now, there's only 2 ways to go. We well document in the journalism business the ones that fail, you know, and put on white hoods and burn people down. But for every segregated community and neighborhood behind fences that we have places like Phillipsburg, Montana. People who have not just survived but thrived because they learned how to get along with their neighbors, and they followed that roadmap towards just making themselves smile every day. They come over to the United States and they see people who from their own countries would have been fighting each other, and they're living peacefully. And they say, well, heck, that's why I came. And so they get a leg up. They get started that way. You know, why fight is the question I get over and over again when I ask people, okay, how come you get along and we don't? How come we can study Coney Island Boulevard and see really a microcosm of the world? Well, it's because the world is here. That's what I'm talking about. So you see what we all have in common. Now, yes, there are dark shadows on the earth, but I've spent a long career in journalism talking to people who seek common sense solutions together. And you know, if there were a bunch of reporters in a car with me and the right front tire went flat, they would all jump out, glance at the tire, and then start tweeting. And come back 6 weeks later and lament the fact that that tire is still flat. But I became determined, as you all here in this class today, to check all the other tires and ask one simple question. How come the others are still up? And maybe how much tread do they still have on them? You know, should we alter the tire a little bit so it doesn't wear out? And I think that's as much, it's more important than just the litany of the problems. We all know what our problems are. We all know what is and what should be, but we don't necessarily know what was. And in America, that's what was. That's why we're still here, and we're not the Middle East most of the time, and we are not Northern and Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and had those kinds of things. And sure, we've got the big problems, but we've also got these quiet Americans who've come up with answers. That's why you need to go out and add names, overlook names to that address list of people with really good ideas, because seeking wisdom from seemingly ordinary people, you will find that wisdom doesn't always wear a suit. Thank you very much. Well, I used to do all kinds of, I still do, breaking news as well as features, but I convinced the people who signed my paycheck that it's as important in the puzzle of what this world's all about to investigate These are not feature stories. These are not, if you read the book, they're not just funny, ha-ha, wonderful, heartwarming. Some of them are, but they're investigative reports on seemingly ordinary people, because what they've discovered, kind of like that guy that figured out, how to get power and money, is a blueprint for all of us, and just to kind of get through life, basically. So, fortunately, for all these years, NBC has thought that was as important in the mix as covering the next hurricane. We do them both. Well, most people trust journalists these days about as much as they trust lawyers and garbage men. And in some ways, we've fallen down on our job. Our job is not to be friends with the government, but to be a watchdog, pure and simple. But having said that, it's very difficult, because look at the relationships that people have. Jobs are made and lost by buddying up with government agencies and what have you. But I'm mostly hopeful that this will be this age of social media, where everyone can be a citizen journalist. Everyone can point out what they see and do. That kind of breaks up that monopoly, that intention, you spend too much time with people in Congress, for instance. You start to do stories because you're relating to the people you're covering. But still, there's somebody out in Topeka, Kansas, who has a piece of information that's very important, and even though maybe as a journalist you fall down because you side with one side of government or another, especially, there was a golden age of journalism, especially television journalism, from about 1927 till about 10, 15 years ago, where, especially in this country, you had to be in the middle. You had to report all sides. Otherwise, people wouldn't buy your soap. But in the last 10, 15 years, we're going back to the way it was just prior to our Revolutionary War here in the United States, where every journalistic cable outlet found that they can make money if they take sides, if they become mostly opinion. And that's the hardest nut to crack, because you look at the media and you say, okay, they're always going to answer it exactly this way, and then these guys are always going to answer it that way. And as a watcher or consumer of information, who's right? Especially if they're shuffling the deck and not telling you the whole story. That's why I think it was so important for people to do what I've been doing for the last lifetime, and that is to go out, especially now with social media. It's easier to find people with voices that aren't affiliated necessarily, and come up with information that people can use. But you have to do that by being investigative in places that you wouldn't normally go to. And that's about the best we can hope for, because the rest of it is all human nature. And like corruption in government, you can get people in journalism to get too close to it too, and how do you blow that up? Well, you blow it up, I think, with social media. It's very difficult for somebody to say this is the way it absolutely is, state media, if everybody else knows, because of social media, that there are other ideas and other information out there. So we can all hope, and that's the best we can hope for. And the other good news is they still pay me. So, and I'm a gadfly. I go out and do stuff that isn't normal, and talk to people who aren't usually asked, and throw their hat into the discussion too. So there is some hope.